Hey, today is day 258. We're reading the whole Bible this year, and today is Daniel 7 through 9. It's a new section of Daniel. We're moving out of the narrative story and into prophecies set aside in each chapter that are taking place throughout the narrative we have already read. Chapter 7 is going to be at the beginning of Belshazzar's reign, which was chapter 5. Chapter 8, still during Belshazzar. Chapter 9, at the beginning of Darius the Mede's reign. That said, let's get into these. There's a lot to talk about. As we talk about apocalyptic literature, a couple of things to keep in mind. One, the language is really weird. The imagery is very strange. It's very foreign to us. It carries a lot of cultural context, and it carries a lot of unclear metaphor in it. Even we are going to read that Daniel himself doesn't always understand what he's seeing. Hold fast to hope, because we know that Yahweh wins in the end. No matter what craziness and everything else, we can trust in him. If we get too fixated on knowing the exact identity of everybody listed here and making sure that everything is dialed in, we know exactly who and what and when and all of that, it almost always leads to weirdness. It's rarely helpful, and it's almost always weird and or dangerous. So we want to take a step back, recognize that this tells us how glorious and wonderful Yahweh is, and that he wins in the end. We can trust in the Lord. That is our key takeaway as we read through these things. That's our foundation as we read through these things. That said, let's dig in. Chapter 7, 4 beasts that there's a good chance, many scholars think this, not all, but maybe this lines up with the 4 kingdoms described in Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. We see the 4th kingdom being destroyed by the rock of Yahweh. It'll be destroyed by a kingdom that is Yahweh's kingdom that will last forever. And that's the same kind of thing we see here. 4th kingdom destroyed by Yahweh's kingdom, or overcome by Yahweh's Messiah, messenger, the Son of Man. And then he will reign forever and establish a kingdom that will never end. That's Jesus. So somehow or other, the king that reigns forever is Jesus. The 3 main ideas for who this 4th kingdom is are either ancient Greece, which has a pretty good case for it because of some pretty consistent things in the next couple chapters as well that seem to point toward the Greek king Antiochus IV. The timeline and description of things laid out here, time times half a time, that seems to mean 3.5. If that's all accurate, then we have some other things in the next couple of chapters that seem to also point at that sort of a timeline for this. Also, the description of what actually happens also lines up, because Antiochus IV desecrates the temple, sets up an altar to Zeus in the temple, and then ultimately the temple is restored after a little more than 3 years. And so potentially that could be him. Some people think it's Rome being taken down by the king that will never cease to reign, is Jesus and his victory on the cross. That could be it. Or it could be still pointing to some things that are yet to happen. It could be a combination of all 3. All of that is somewhat valid in interpretive prophecy, as we recognize a lot of the time. There's a both and, a now and not yet. And so there's something for the audience right then, and there's much to be understood and gained in the future from it. In the end, Yahweh wins. So be a part of his kingdom and his people. That's the ultimate destination of those who trust in the Lord. In chapter 8, we hear about a ram with 2 horns and then the goat. We know that the 2 horns on the ram are Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great dies suddenly in the midst of his power. That one horn is broken. 4 of his generals each claim power, end up warring amongst themselves within a couple of years. And for decades, this goes on until a couple of them win. And then finally, Antiochus IV rises up, and he becomes this really powerful one who sort of takes over. And so that one horn overshadowing the others. So all of this seems to fit. I mean, not seems to, but it fits events that happened after the time of Daniel for sure. And I mean, real specifically, like it really matches really well. This is one of those times where it's pretty well agreed upon that specifically is talking about Alexander the Great his 4 generals, and then Antiochus IV being the one who desecrates the temple and all of that. The angel tells Daniel that timeline that he gives of 2,300 evenings and mornings, or 1,150 days, which is just shy of 3.5 years. It's a little over 3 years, because some of that lines up really well. And that is explained pretty clearly. Then we go back and go, well, maybe chapter 7 is also about Antiochus IV. Also, maybe there's a both and component here, where now there's stuff that's happening in ancient Greece. And then some of this is still looking forward to an ultimate time when Yahweh will rule and reign. Could go either way. I tend to lean towards generally now and not yet. There's some of it that happens closer to the time, and some of it that is still yet to be fulfilled, or that a mirror, a parallel to those kinds of things will happen in the future, where again, a powerful nation will rise up and these things will happen. But ultimately, the kingdom of Yahweh reigns in the end. That is always the conclusion and the result. So in the beginning of chapter 9, Daniel is reading Jeremiah and realizes that, it's about to happen. The exile is coming to an end. Lord, forgive us. And he kind of prays this intercessory prayer of confession and a plea for restoration. So as Daniel is finishing up his prayer and asking for the Lord to hear and forgive and act on behalf of his people, the angel Gabriel shows up again. And he basically tells him, what you pray for is not exactly going to work out, but you're going to be given an answer because of your righteousness. And then the answer is crazy. This last section of Daniel 9, verses 24 through 27. Let's talk these 70 weeks. 4 verses, so much to talk about. One of the most confusing and complicated pieces of scripture, period. 70 sevens, or 70 weeks, describes 490 years. We know that not just from guessing at like, what could 7 sevens be? But this same pattern of description of time is used in Leviticus 25 to talk about the year of Jubilee. He says 7 sevens, which is 7 periods of 7 years, adding up to 49 years for the year of Jubilee. And so here, when we see 70 sevens or 70 weeks, which is periods of 7 days, right? Then we go, okay, got it. It's 490 years. Then as we read down a little bit, it talks about, bringing an end to sacrifice, end to sin, atoning for iniquity, everlasting righteousness, seal both vision and prophet, anoint most holy place. Like all of these things seem to speak toward the things that Jesus does. And then an anointed one raised up seems to speak of Jesus. Then we have what seems to be some separation of the times. So there's 2 ways to understand this. One, is it 490 years altogether? When does that start? When does it end? That puts timelines all over the place, depending on where you place this. Or it maybe takes them and it says there is 7 weeks, which would be 49 years. One section that seems to be the restoration of the release of the Jews back into Israel and the restoration of Jerusalem. Maybe it's that. If it's that, then if we take a little bit of a break and allow for 50 years of that, but then take a pause, and so we can push the timeline a little bit, then at the end of 62 weeks, which is 400 plus years, then that puts us at the crucifixion. Maybe we have 1 more week left where, for 1 week, someone is going to make a strong covenant with many. And this could be the Antichrist in the future. At some point, this could be Titus, who ruins the sanctuary and destroys Jerusalem in AD 70, or the temple at least. This could pagan worship all around there. It could be him. There's so many different ways of understanding these things. And 1 week left is only 7 years. This is where a lot of the time of the tribulation works out, that for a week and then for half the week and all of that lines up for some people with moments in Revelation. And it could, and maybe it does. Or maybe it's both, or maybe it's neither. And the tribulation isn't what we think it is. All of that to say, the final result, the thing we need to take away from this, because scholars believe every option I just laid out and more. But what we need to take away from this is that no matter what happens, no matter what it is we witness, we know that even when we see, and Jesus spoke about the abomination of desolation in the future, so that could be Titus because it happened after Jesus, or it could be something that's still to come, or a bit of both. No matter what, in the end, beyond that time, there is an ultimate end to sin and a restoration, and all things have been atoned for, and Yahweh's kingdom and king will reign forever. And that is Jesus, for sure. That is Jesus. So let us not get too caught up in all this other stuff. It's fun to speculate about. It's interesting to talk about. And it can be good to help serve us with a warning that these kinds of things, no matter how horrible and evil, might happen, likely will happen in our future still, as we await the return of Christ. Let us not be swayed or discouraged by those things, but still firmly place our hope in Christ and in his plans. That's my takeaway. I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and comments. So, hey, let's talk about this in the comments, in the chat. There's a lot to discuss. Be civil, be gracious, and be loving toward one another, and relax. God wins. We don't have to get overly concerned about this. Pray for understanding and recognize that there are very smart, godly people who still disagree with whatever it is that you land on with it. Let's get into it. Jump in the chat and ask your questions, share your thoughts, and let's try and encourage one another toward Yahweh, point each other toward Jesus evermore. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Be rad for Jesus.